I'm Dr. Erica Bove, and welcome to the Love and Science podcast. I'm your host, and also the founder of Love and Science, Thriving Through Infertility. I'm so excited you're here today. With over a decade of experience helping thousands of women just like you, I empower professional women to build their families with confidence and compassion. Let's dive in. Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Love and Science podcast. Today, I'm going to talk about something that I've been asked about quite a bit recently. And, I'm also just going to say, first of all, Happy New Year, because this is the first podcast of 2025. I'm so grateful to be here. And, I named my coaching practice Love and Science for a very important reason, right? Like it takes both to bring about a baby. It takes both to bring about a good outcome. And, I sort of share this, that as I have done my embryo transfers, I think about that. I think about it takes love, it takes science. I try to make sure there's both in the transfer room to make this go smoothly for a patient, for a couple. Similarly, in my coaching practice, even if I'm not the one putting in the embryo, I really do believe it takes both. And if you look at my podcast episodes, I think it's a little clear that I like to talk about love more than I like to talk about science. Maybe because I feel that the science is sort of something I could talk about in my sleep. And the love part, the growth part, that's sort of what lights me up. It's what sort of makes me think about pushing the boundaries of things that have never been tried in this field before. And you know me, I'm not doing bench science research every single day. And so I also do think, though, it really does take a special skill to distill something complicated and make it palatable. Especially if you're already a doctor and you're struggling with all the different terms and, differences. Maybe you're in critical care, maybe you're in the ER, or maybe you work with kids and this is just so far from your branch of medicine. That is one thing that I actually love doing, is helping especially women physicians to understand things better. So I'm going to make a conscious effort this year to balance out the science part, because I do think that knowledge is power. And the more I can share what is second nature to me, the more that I can keep sharing, the fruits of my reading, which I pretty much go to PubMed and read new papers every single day because I have such a hunger to understand. And let me share that with you, because I do think that, together we navigate this thing, which is personalized care, and understanding how can we use the science to enhance our journeys and bring about the best possible outcomes. So that having been said, that will frame kind of how I think about 2025 with science and love and science. I wanted to talk about this topic of where did all of my eggs go? We won't just be talking about eggs today. We'll be talking about the whole process of IVF, but over and over and over again, I find that educated women are devastated, heartbroken at the fact that they had a certain number of follicles and there were only so many eggs. And then at the very end of it, there was like, maybe one embryo, maybe two embryos, or sometimes even better than that. But it's just always so shocking to say, okay, well, I physically saw on ultrasound all these follicles. Where did all of my eggs go? So let's think about the physiology of what's happening during IVF. So what is happening is that instead of one dominant follicle rising to the top like it does in an unassisted cycle and hogging all the FSH through the FSH receptors, what IVF does is it provides super physiological doses of FSH and also LH so that an entire cohort of eggs can be brought up together. So eggs are social. You may have heard me say this before, which is funny because I'm an introvert. So if I were an egg, I'd probably be all by my lonesome. But the truth is that eggs like to be surrounded by other eggs, and they communicate with each other via gap junctions. And it's use it or lose it, right? So it always makes me very sad to talk about this, but you have the one dominant egg and you have the whole cohort that's with it. And even if we're doing nothing that month, even if we're on birth control or, in some other quiescent state, there's just whole cohorts of eggs that just go away. If you remember from medical school, they're actually quote unquote destined for atresia until one of them is rescued by FSH. And so what is IVF but rescuing a cohort that's destined for atresia, but an entire cohort, not just one egg at a time. So as we get older, our cohort size goes down. For some reason, the body recognizes when we start to get low on eggs and we go through fewer eggs every month. That is the whole concept behind the andro follicle count. So, you can reference my episode on egg reserve values, but andro follicle count is the ultrasound-based parameter that we look at when we're trying to understand medication dosing. We're trying to understand how many eggs do we think we might get for somebody in a given cycle. Excuse me. So what we're looking at is like, okay, so somebody has, 12 follicles that we can measure on their baseline ultrasound. In an ideal world, we would get 12 plus or minus 2 eggs because that's about the cohort size. Now, we know that when we start exposing a cohort that's at baseline to gonadotropins, namely FSH, we know that we can sort of get, ideally, that whole cohort to grow at approximately the same rate. Now, there are times when there is a cohort that is up ahead of the other cohort, and you truly see two distinct humps. But what I will say is it is very normal for there to be a few follicles above 14 millimeters and then a bunch of other smaller follicles that are below 14 millimeters. Now, the way that we look at IVF is that, we give the FSH from the outside world. The FSH upregulates aromatase. Aromatase is in the granulosa cells. If you remember to be super nerdy about it, it's the 2-cell, 2-gonadotropin story. So you have your FSH acting on your granulosa cells, and you're getting the conversion of testosterone to estradiol. And so when you have a follicle, the granulosa cells are putting out estradiol. So by the time that you have a mature cohort of follicles, each mature egg, which is within a follicle, that follicle unit should be making about 200 to 250 picograms of estradiol that is represented in the serum. It doesn't always work that way because you have the little guys too, and sometimes a lot of little guys can contribute quite a bit. And you could say, well, my estrogen was 6,000. Like, why don't I have, more eggs than I got? Well, maybe it's a lot of little guys, little mature ones. But the whole point is to get enough follicles above 14 millimeters where you can hopefully get to at least one good egg and one good embryo from the group. Now, of course, we like to have as many as possible, but the whole point is embryo selection. So we give FSH, we see the follicles growing on ultrasound, we see the estradiol rising. And, at times, like, sometimes people say, well, why didn't they push me another day? Maybe I could have gotten the 10s or the 12s. And, the art of art, as I like to say, is that sometimes the body tells us when the cohort is ready. So when the estradiol starts to plateau or even drop sometimes, when the progesterone starts to rise, that shows us that there's not too much more benefit of pushing the cycle to try and get more follicles. And sometimes, like, ideal follicle size is, people argue, maybe 14 to 22 millimeters. A little bit more narrow range is 15 to 20 millimeters. And so if you start getting bigger follicles like 23, 24, 25 millimeters, not only are you at increased risk of ovulating those follicles, but it might actually be sort of post-mature. You might lose that egg and sacrifice it for the sake of the whole group. And so the whole point of IVF is getting the best cohort possible of those mature size follicles. Like I said, anything that's 14 or 15 millimeters or above has the chance for maturity, because only mature eggs have the possibility of being fertilized by sperm, right? So meiosis resumes and we have the kicking out of the body. That's why it's called M2, an M2 oocyte. And then, with fertilization, hopefully you get another kicking out of a polar body, and then you have the 2 pronuclei that develop. Now, there is a lot of inefficiency in reproduction. So for instance, not every follicle that is seen on ultrasound actually has a mature egg inside. You might even have a 16 millimeter follicle, but maybe the egg inside is immature. I remember when I was a fellow, I saw this graph of like the sort of percent chance that each size follicle will contain a mature egg inside. And it was, the sort of started at 14 millimeters, but the greatest chance really is once those follicles are 18, 19, 20 millimeters, right? Because they've gone through more, they have more estradiol, they've been able to go through the process for a little bit longer. So that's really the physiology of IVF is, again, trying to get as many follicles as possible in a tight cohort from 14 to 22 millimeters in a way that the estrogen is still safe. It's not like an estrogen that's super, super high, that the progesterone is not rising early, especially if somebody desires a fresh transfer. And also, I always say to my patients, like, we're just trying to balance safety and success here, right? We're trying to make it safe to go through this process. And overall, it's pretty well tolerated, but there are certain things that, increase the risk, like super high estradiol and other things. And so we really do want to make sure that, it's a safe process. But then success, right? So not everybody's goals are the same. Say somebody doesn't have infertility, but they're doing IVF for genetic reasons, it might be possible to sort of have a more vigorous response for that person, understanding that we're going to freeze all the embryos and that it's going to take a lot of embryos to get to an unaffected chromosomally normal embryo, right? Or say somebody only has an androgen follicle count of 2 or 3, you might really be doing everything you can to get, up to 3 eggs in that person. And so it really does depend. There's a real art to this. And I just wanted to be very clear that, it's unfortunately not abnormal for every follicle not to have an egg inside, that many follicles just don't have at least a mature egg inside. And so even though the REI does their very best with the best technique and everything to get every single egg, I usually look at the number of follicles above 14 millimeters at the time of retrieval and say, listen, this is what I say to my patients, like, you've got 10 follicles that are 14 millimeters or above, and I expect anywhere between 5 and 10 mature eggs. I usually divide that number by 2. And that's usually a pretty good range, right? To say, okay, well, we're going to expect 5 to 10 eggs. I think sometimes it's like, well, come out of the retrieval and it's like, okay, 10 follicles, we got 9 eggs. This is fantastic. But there's this mismatch of expectations. It's like, but what happened to the other egg? Maybe that's the one that was going to be my baby. And, I really just wanted to normalize that not every follicle necessarily has a mature egg inside. Also, looking at the number, like the estradiol level too. So say the, estrogen level was like 2000, I'd say, okay, well, maybe we will get around 10, maybe. But if the estradiol is like 500, and there's a bunch of follicles, we can surmise that perhaps there's not going to be 10 mature eggs inside because typically speaking, that just doesn't match up with the estradiol levels too. So this is sort of a window into how an REI thinks about it, but sort of it takes some open-mindedness. It takes some understanding that it's not one for one. And I think that does help people when they understand that. Okay. So then let's talk about what happens on the day of the egg retrieval. So every single reputable place I've worked at, and I've only worked at reputable places, goes through a checklist of things before an egg retrieval. And you have to do this basically to get accredited too. So it's not like, every single place has to do this. So going through a checklist of like, what's the temperature on the block and what is the pressure of the, fluid as it flows through the tubing? Because basically you have an ultrasound probe and you have a needle guide that's attached to that probe. And then you have, something like a 16 or a 17 gauge needle that goes through the needle guide. And under direct visualization, you put the needle tip through the wall of the vagina into the follicle under direct visualization, and then aspirate the fluid from each follicle. So the first thing is, before anything is said or done, the settings are, double checked to make sure that they're appropriate. Temperature, pressure, just making sure that there is fluid that's going through the tubing, that there's not any airlocks anywhere, and all those sorts of things. So a lot of tight control there. And then the procedure starts, and the first follicle is aspirated, and then sequentially, typically we stay in one ovary at a time. And the lab then receives the fluid, which has gone from the needle tip through the needle, through the tubing, into the actual tubes themselves, temperature controlled, and then they're brought to the lab where the eggs, the follicular fluid is looked through under a microscope to pick out the eggs that are there. And so, usually this happens like we have a pass through in our lab where, the medical assistant or maybe a medical student or resident, like an extra pair of hands, sometimes even a nurse will take that fluid and hand it through a window in the wall and hand it directly to the lab, or even like put it on a temperature block so that the temperature is maintained, because eggs like things, around a certain temperature. So that happens, and then we start getting the egg count from the lab. And so they might say like first egg, second egg, third egg, which is fantastic because we don't always get eggs during retrieval. So I'm always happy to hear that we have eggs. And so what happens is, especially in somebody who has few follicles, I really want to know like which follicles gave eggs, which one didn't. And in those situations, sometimes I do like one tube at a time, like drain one follicle into one tube and then to go into the next follicle. Now that is a little deceiving because there's the tubing. So sometimes you might drain a follicle and the egg actually might be in the tube itself, right? In the tubing itself. But in general, if I'm really concerned about egg yield, sometimes I truly go follicle by follicle. It's just kind of a little tip I learned over the years. But sometimes you don't know. Like sometimes, especially if the ovary is very vigorous, you go and you aspirate each follicle on that side. And sometimes the lab is even like 4 or 5 tubes behind in terms of counting the eggs, because we tend to work quickly. And I will also say like there is a downside to working slowly, because if the fluid is at all bloody, which it sometimes can be, the corpus luteum, right, is a hemorrhagic cyst. So if you think about that physiology, like you don't want there to be blood that's clotting in the tube either. So it's a balance between like moving quickly and also kind of understanding which follicles are yielding eggs. But, as long as it's in that expected ballpark, which is 50 to 100% of the number of follicles that are above 14 millimeters, I call that a successful retrieval. Now, there are things that we can do in the context of the retrieval itself to, try and increase the chances of good egg yields, right? So the first thing is making sure all the settings are good ahead of time. My fellows know I'm a real stickler about like there not being air in the tubes. Pretty much every REI I've worked with has been that way as well. People do talk about like using a double lumen catheter and if flushing the tubes makes a difference. I've not seen any data that those techniques dramatically improve egg yield. Otherwise, I would probably be using them with all my retrievals actually. I tend to curette the follicle a little bit just to see kind of if there's any. I have like a no egg left behind program. So I say, if there's an egg, I'm going to try to get it. So I put the, needle in the center of the follicle through the shearing forces. Truly, that's why we measure the pressure. Through the shear forces alone, really, you should be able to get a mature egg, because through the whole cumulus complex, it kind of puffs up off the wall of the follicle. If you look at a diagram in a textbook. So, theoretically, if there is a mature egg, you should be able to get it with your typical settings. But I do tend to curette the follicles just, in case the egg is stuck on the follicle wall. I do think that sometimes that helps. Honestly, though, in practice, I think that probably just increases the number of immature eggs that I get, because typically the immature ones are the ones that don't puff up on the wall of the follicle. They tend to be smaller, and they tend to stay kind of stuck to the wall of follicle, which is why I think that sometimes when we retrieve follicles, we don't necessarily get an egg from that follicle, because the immature egg stays stuck inside. So isn't that frustrating that not every single egg that is in the body actually goes through that process of meiosis? It is incredibly frustrating. And that's why so many people are looking at, in vitro maturation to see if there is something that we could do to turn the immature eggs into mature eggs. I think that would have a lot of promise, not just for people with PCOS who tend to have a high number of immature eggs, but also, prepubescent girls who get cancers, premenarchal girls, there's still so so little that we can do to help those people. I mean, we can do some things, but egg freezing is really the gold standard for most people who get a diagnosis of cancer. And for people who have not gone through puberty yet, it's really, you're talking about getting immature eggs at that point, or ovarian tissue. So right. So, okay. So what are the possibilities? So say, you have an egg retrieval, you have 8 follicles, and your REI comes out to you and says, I'm so sorry, we only got 2 eggs. Like, crushing, heartbreaking, awful, awful news. I've unfortunately been on the giving end of that news more times than I can count. I've helped patients and clients come to grips with that really, really awful news. And it's really devastating. So I think to try to understand from a scientific standpoint, like what actually happened, it can be helpful to try and understand. So, the first thing is that, perhaps that follicle never had an egg inside. We do see that, especially in older women, kind of empty follicle syndrome. And this usually doesn't happen with every single follicle, but a lot of times we can retrieve an egg, retrieve a follicle, especially if it's on the bigger side, and there truly just is not an egg inside. So that is one possibility. Another possibility is that the egg is actually immature and it stayed stuck to the follicle wall. And I do see this, quite a bit in my practice, especially probably with the 12, 13, 14 millimeter follicles. They probably do have eggs inside, but they're probably just, immature. And so they remain inside the body. Now, would it make sense to do an insemination if that would fit with your treatment cycle? I mean, usually not, because there's usually enough eggs to compensate. But there have been times when I did a retrieval for 2 or 3 follicles and I truly got no eggs. And the thought is like, okay, well, there's probably still an egg inside. Maybe it'll mature in the next, 24 to 48 hours and be released. And so have I ever had a pregnancy from that situation? I haven't, but it's also probably been only a handful of patients who I've helped in that way, done an insemination on the same day as the retrieval. And so, that is possible, that it's just an immature egg that stayed stuck inside. And that's the explanation. The third possibility is that the egg truly disintegrated. So remember, it has a ways to go, even with all conditions being optimal. It's got to go from the follicle through the needle tip, through the needle, through the tubing to the tubes, and then to the IVF lab. So, these are cells, like an egg is a single cell. So is it possible that a fragile egg could disintegrate on the way through from the ovary to the lab itself? And the answer is yes, it can, unfortunately. And we always ask, in settings where we're not getting as many eggs as we think that we should be getting, we always ask the lab, like, can you see cells? That at least suggests it's a follicle, granulosa cells. Sometimes they just say, no, this is just straw colored fluid. There's no cells inside, which suggests that even though it looked like a follicle on the ultrasound, it was truly just a cyst. So these are some of the things that we think about. And so the answer to like, where did all my eggs go? I hope this helps. It certainly does not take away the pain of having unexpected results. But, unfortunately, biology is very inefficient. And I do hope this shines some light on those things. Now, that having been said, I'm always happier when we get more eggs and a retrieval than fewer eggs. But it really does just take one good egg and one good embryo. And so I can't tell you the number of times when I've retrieved like one egg and it fertilized. And then it was like the little embryo that could. And that one little embryo results in a baby. So, I think one of the keys is not to lose hope if this happens to you. Like if you have a wildly discordant number of eggs compared to what what you expected, like every egg still does have a chance. And also, there's a lot that can be learned about the body in these situations that can then inform future cycles. And so this is not to be Pollyanna about this at all, because those of you who know me know that I'm not that way at all. But I do say, okay, all is not lost. This is not square one. Like, what do we know now that we didn't know before? Maybe it's that we do an estrogen priming cycle the next time. Maybe it's that we switch the protocol. Maybe that it's that we, do a retrieval on the sooner side before the follicles get so big. Maybe if we have a high number of immature eggs, maybe we push the follicles to bigger sizes. Like there's all these different alterations that we can make in another cycle that I think are really, really important to think about. And, that's why we train for like so many years to do this work and that we're so passionate about it. But for every single person, I always want the best possible outcome. And I know that's what that you want as the patient and the client too. So my thought is like, let's figure it out together in a way that makes it such that whatever your highest chances are of having the best retrieval possible for you, that's what happens. So, say you get to the eggs, they fertilize, it's the same sort of inefficient phenomenon that not every fertilized egg will continue growing. And so, say you get 10 eggs that are retrieved, say 8 are mature, say 6 fertilize, and say you have 2 blastocysts at the end of the day to work with, that would be a very typical cycle. And of course, it depends on your age and your diagnosis, but much of the time we're really thinking about a blastocyst conversion rate of 25 to 50%, which means that however many eggs fertilize, that's your number of embryos. Then you take that number and multiply it by, 25 to 50%. And that's what is realistic to think about in terms of how many blastocysts you might end up with at the end of the day. And then, of course, like options vary if you're thinking about biopsying the embryos or whether you're going to do a fresh transfer or whether you're going to freeze them untested. Like there's so many different ways you can do it, or even a day 3 transfer. We do a lot of those in my practice too. And they work, which is, hey, it's lifelong learning. I kind of had thought at one point in time that day 3s were really not that helpful. But now where I'm at in my practice, I have an excellent embryologist and I've seen the power of day 3 transfers. And so I think in certain people that can be a benefit too. So just understanding that, like, not just where did all my eggs go, where did all my embryos go, right? So what I would say to that question is, we know that basically from the moment of fertilization, that's what really matters in terms of the ploidy of the embryo. And so from that standpoint, there's all these cell divisions, and remember, there's crossover of chromosomes and such. And there's all of the things that happen for a 2-cell embryo to then develop into a human being, right? Like a multi-cell, multi-organ human being. So I would say, just to kind of put it in perspective, by day 3, we're hoping for about 8 cells. So that's, 2 cells to 8 cells. And then by day 5, because it's exponential growth, we're talking closer to like 100 to 200 cells in the blastocyst. So, there's a lot going on in that IVF lab. And just understanding that not every embryo is going to be viable or potentially viable. And one of the ways that we sort that out in the lab is we see the embryo progression. If the embryos are arresting, they're telling us that they're not viable, right? Like an embryo that arrests is not going to make a baby. And so an embryo that keeps progressing in the lab, that embryo has a chance at moving forward. And so, it's just a very, very interesting phenomenon, this whole embryo progression thing, the fact that we can look at it under a microscope and, tell certain characteristics about embryos. We also know, though, that sometimes the most beautiful embryos don't make babies. And sometimes crummier looking embryos are the ones where the embryo, people have their baby and they say, well, it wasn't the best quality in the IVF lab, but here she is, or here he is. So I'll just say that as a reminder, I do think that, especially when there's a lot of threat, when there's a lot of fear, when there's a lot of uncertainty, I think it's really, really easy to get into a scarcity mindset. And, I did say this was a more sciencey post, but I do kind of have to put in my thoughts about the dangers of stressing out and worrying about the inefficiency in a way that really starts to take over and become counterproductive. So, I think that whenever we're in a scarcity mindset, we don't make our best decisions, right? Our frontal lobe goes offline, we start to fear, we start to panic, we start to be anxious. And I think at some level, we do not trust it's going to work out for us. And so, it makes sense. Like, I thought I was going to get 10 eggs and here I got 3 eggs. And now, like, what if I'm not going to become a parent, or what if I need to do more IVF cycles and I don't know if I can afford it? Like, this whole line of thinking, it makes sense why our brains offer this to us. But that is an incredibly stressful state to find ourselves in, right? Like panic, fear, scarcity, um, lack. We start becoming truly desperate for what's going to make the situation better. And when that happens, our cortisol levels rise. We stop sleeping. We stop thinking clearly. We think, okay, well, what went wrong, and why did that happen, and why did my REI not make this different decision? And a lot of this is looking at the cycle in retrospect, and either we pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, I made the best decision ever, it worked out, or gosh, like knowing what I know now, would I have made a different decision? It's not one size fits all either. And so if you find yourself starting to get into that scarcity, that lack, that like looking at sort of, okay, what happened to the other 7 eggs? And this is never going to work out for me, like all those associated thoughts that go along with it, that's when I would ask yourself to say, I know this is what my brain's offering me at this point in time, but are these thoughts serving me? Like, if this is meant to be, it is going to happen. I am doing everything in my power to make this happen. I am resourceful. I trust my REI. Like, I'm just offering some more useful thoughts that tend to get us out of that scarcity mindset and into a more abundant mindset where there is possibility, where there is, the chance that even 2 embryos might work out for an individual. And gosh, it's so hard when we want something more than anything else in the world. It's so hard not to like attach to that outcome and just say like, this has to happen. This has to happen in this way. This has to happen by this time. And like, what if, like all the questions, all that mind noise that is so hard to turn down. But I will say, number one, it feels so crummy. And number two, we're not resonating at the highest frequency, right? Like if we're talking about being receptive to an embryo, being receptive to the process, our bodies working the way that they're supposed to work, physiologically, all that additional stress is not good for us, truly. And I believe it at the cellular level. So I guess this does come back to science. But my people who have been the most successful over time are the ones who are able to hope for the best and release the outcome. Again, this is the secret sauce. This is what people get usually after at least weeks of coaching with me, because it takes some time to get the hang of it. Our type A female physician nature does not lend itself to this sort of thinking. But you get your A team, right? You get your fertility physician who you trust, hopefully you've also vetted the lab, that you're at a reputable center. You get your REI coach, because I think everybody deserves a coach, and really get people who are rooting for you, who are in your corner, and people who can take the mental burden off of you so you don't have to worry as much, or somebody who can explain what they think happened to you in detail so that you don't have to go down that Google rabbit hole and try and figure it out for yourself. So what I would say is, I truly believe that when we think about fertility, it is so important to shift into an abundant mindset. It is so important to think about the possibility, to envision things happening, to, focus on the wins. There's always going to be good news and there's always going to be some bad news, but where our attention goes, the energy flows, right? And so that's what I would say is, yes, there are it's really the rare situation where we get every single egg, for the number of follicles. It really is the rare situation. We do our best, but unfortunately biology is inefficient. And so there's that. And then understanding that, even from the embryo stage, that biology is inefficient. But the whole point, like it's almost, in some ways, it's almost a good thing that there's that inefficiency, because the eggs and the embryos are telling us that they're not the ones that are going to get us to our goal. So if you can have that mindset, at least try it on. Like, that's the thing about these thoughts with coaching, is that we have to like almost like try it on like we would a coat in a store, and say, if the coat fits, then I'm going to, buy it and take it home. But if the coat doesn't fit, then I got to find a different coat that fits. But the whole point is our thoughts should serve us. And, I hope that this, just as lectures on cardiac physiology help me understand things better that I may not understand in my sleep and intuitively, or maybe lectures about exercise physiology or whatever it is where I'm always just amazed to learn more details about things that maybe I didn't pick up in medical school, or maybe the science has evolved in certain ways since, gosh, as I do the math, it's been a good 20 years now. So, just thinking about, let's lean on each other, let's have an abundant mindset, and let's believe in possibility. And, if you in particular are wondering, like, where did all my eggs go? Where did all my embryos go? Let's have a conversation about it. I love helping people come to terms with the science, to understand the science. And I love helping people get an emotional game plan for dealing with the news and moving forward. So I hope this was helpful. Like I said, more science episodes to come. But as you know, I love you, and may this knowledge give you power to bring about the best possible outcome for yourself. Until the next time, bye. Thank you for listening to the Love and Science podcast. I'm so glad you joined us today. If you found this conversation valuable, if you could please rate, review, and share this podcast with your trusted people, it would mean so much to me. If you want more tools to help you navigate the fertility journey, please book a discovery call with me today. The link is in the show notes. Please do not let infertility have the final word. I'm here to take the burden from you so that you can achieve your goal of building your family. In gratitude, this is Dr. Erica Bove. I'm rooting for you always.